Time now for the Daily Answer, sponsored by Salem Surround on The Answer Now TV.
Affordability, affordability, affordability. The White House has heard you. They have heard us talking about this issue and why it is important that the president continue to use the word and focus on it, because the Democrats have done so with great effect. It's frustrated this president because he knows his agenda is actually focused on the long-term economic viability for everyone in this country, not the Democrats. He addresses this yesterday a little bit at number 47.
Or my pledge to every family and every small business is that I will not rest until you are richer, stronger, more successful, happier, till you've gotten a piece of the American dream. Some of you in this room have really gotten a piece of it because you made a great decision to go with a great, great company years ago. And it's really pretty amazing. That begins with making America. We have to do, the word is affordable. And affordable should be our word, not theirs, because the Democrats got up and talked affordability, and they don't say that they had the worst inflation in history, the highest energy prices in history. Everything was the worst. What they're great at is lying. They say affordability. This stuff was all much more expensive. We have a couple of items like coffee, which is a little high. We're going to get that down. You saw that today. The coffee comes down. Remember when I first took over, eggs. My third day in office, I have a news conference, and the fake news media was screaming at me, Mr. Congressman, about eggs. Remember that? I'm standing there very innocent. Oh, hello. Do you have any questions? What about eggs? What about them? They're up 4 times. I said, look, I just got here. I'm sorry.
Affordability. President Trump is well aware that's what's on everyone's minds, and he is addressing it. Over at Town Hall, Scott McClellan, wrote this. The Fed, or at least one of the Fed officials, has backed Vice President Vance. Illegal immigration is driving soaring housing prices. The Federal Reserve Governor Stephen Mnuchin, who's been a guest of this show, told Fox News deportations are slowing inflation. Quote, a significant amount of the inflation that we experienced for years is because we threw millions of new people into the country without sufficiently expanding the housing stock and sufficient expansion of other forms of fixed capital. He continued, the truth is that they're living somewhere, and that's a place where other people in America aren't living. And that was inflationary, cutting down net migration to zero, potentially even negative because of the deportations that have been occurring, I think, is very deflationary. Stephen Miller also exposing the amount of immigrants living in housing in this country is a real problem when addressing affordability of housing. And number 50.
40% of the population of rent-controlled housing in New York City are foreign-born. Think about that. In one of the largest metropolitan areas in the world, 40% of rent-controlled properties are being lived in by people who weren't even born in the country. What kind of system is this? We bring in people from foreign countries, and then we pay to lower the cost of their housing, while people who were born here have to pay higher prices. So when President Trump is reducing net migration, that is what's going to ultimately, along with all these other steps, deregulation, historic tax cuts, going to bring down the cost of housing.
Yes. So it's being addressed, and it's not just that. As you know, tariffs are before the Supreme Court right now, and there are members of Congress on the Republican side that are arguing with the president about this. America faces an invasion. Illegals, yes, and not just from illegals, but from cheap Chinese steel, for instance, that guts our factories, and fentanyl, and cartels killing our kids. So treating tariffs, which is a tool to stop that stuff, treating tariffs as though it's just some tax that Congress has got to approve, like it's a routine budget item, I think that's dead wrong. I think part of making things more affordable are the economic blockades that President Trump put in place, like tariffs, plain and simple. And I believe the presidential powers under Article 2 to seal our borders against threats, just as Lincoln's warships choked rebel supplies, it all happened without a vote. And this is so important to our economic future and affordability, in my view, the Supreme Court must affirm Donald Trump's tariffs as they're mulling it over right now. They've got to strike down legislation that turns our president's shield into some kind of red tape. Look, our borders are economic battlegrounds as much as physical ones. Tariffs are the silent guardian. Picture cheap Beijing steel killing jobs in Pennsylvania mill towns, starving shipyards of hulls. Enter President Donald Trump. He imposes a simple tariff, a customs duty on imports, hiking prices, and it stems the tide. Mills roar back with American steel for ships and weapons, and China's predatory edge stays offshore, preserving some 70,000 lost jobs. Members of Congress, some of them, are peddling these reciprocity bills that treat national security like it's some sort of committee memo. That's overreach. Tariffs aren't some throwaway. They're blockades. They're iron economic walls around sovereignty. The framers armed the executive branch to repel invasions, armed or economic, knowing a dithering Congress nearly doomed the Confederation before. Look, a blockade's genius lies not in the tool, but in the aim. Sever enemy lifelines before peril crosses our shores. Lincoln understood this. Kennedy's 1962 invisible wall, what did it do? It froze Castro's assets amid a missile menace. It isolated Havana from Moscow's grip. Congress complained, but then Congress yielded, as many of you may remember. In 1982, Reagan's penal noose tripled ship penalties, noosing trade routes, starving Cuban proxies. And you heard the howl from Congress then. But the measures endured, despite the outcry. Trump's high-tech drones blast narco boats off the coast of Venezuela, halting fentanyl with precision strikes. No armada of ships needed for a physical blockade, just satellites, drones, and executive will. From cannon to calculator, presidents have always wielded blockades, and tariffs, in my view, are a critical component. It's a critical blockade that snaps supply chains bloodlessly. Tariffs are part of the president's Article 2 core powers, I believe, as commander-in-chief. The inherent authority to impose blockades without congressional pre-approval. And there are many historical points you can look at that I've laid out at the Harum Society if you'd like to read a little more on this. Just yesterday I pointed this out, that you can point to as evidence of the case I'm making here. I invite the Supreme Court to reframe trade wars not as some policy squabble, but as a constitutional blockade. Defensive barriers woven into the president's inherent powers to protect our nation. We have a Supreme Court right now weighing Trump's Liberation Day tariffs this term. And whether it's the fentanyl invasions or the Chinese steel surges, I hope the Supreme Court is considering those things and looking at this through the lens of a presidential blockade. These aren't statutory curiosities or overreaches. These are Article 2 imperatives woven into the framers' design without exclusion for economic forums. Uphold the doctrine. Treat tariffs as blockades. Give deference to the commander-in-chief using this tool as an instrument, as a blockade to protect this nation. Now, I know critics will cry that tariffs are a tax grab, but that's just a distraction. Tariffs aren't domestic taxes squeezing American pockets. They're targeted import barriers. Courts have long upheld similar things, from Lincoln's ships to Kennedy's ledgers to Reagan's snares, Trump's drug boat hits. Halting at tariffs defies logic. When trade arms our adversaries like Beijing's Navy, our commander is the only guy that can sever that flow. Article 2 in our Constitution gives one person, the president, all the executive power, the duty to enforce the laws faithfully, and the role of commander-in-chief. This setup fixed the weak executive under the Articles of Confederation. In fact, if you go back and you read Alexander Hamilton in Federalist number 70, he says that the president needs energy to defend against attacks, whether by armies or economic threats. Tariffs fit that bill perfectly. They apply targeted pressure to enemy supply lines, everything from cotton to currency, drugs, or steel. Presidents must have the right to choose the right tool for the situation, driven by the urgency of the moment. We are tackling illegal immigration pouring across our borders as we are economically tackling unfair trade practices and attacks through tariffs. And the Supreme Court must affirm this if we're to turn this country around.
For full shows, live and on demand, it's Salem News Channel. Stay informed anytime, anywhere with the Salem News Channel and 9:30 a.m. TheAnswer.com. This has been The Daily Answer, sponsored by Salem Surround on The Answer Now TV.